Hello, all, and welcome to tonight's beer review, which I am dubbing the nearly flooded beer review. So, last night it rained really hard, great big thunderstorm, and it almost flooded my car. Luckily, it remained a couple inches below, like, my door jamb and didn't get into the engine or anything like that, thank goodness. And the power went out after a lightning struck a transformer up the road, so, I spent a couple hours drinking probably a little bit too much whiskey because what else is there to do in a torrential rainstorm with no power other than watching the water rise and then slowly fall as the rain ebbs? So, I'm going to be reviewing something pretty interesting today. I believe I've reviewed one Samuel Smith beer before, and I'm going to be reviewing another one today. This is India Ale. Now, Samuel Smith, being a very old and venerable English brewer, going back to the 1750s, and this is basically, you know, what originated the India Pale Ale, the IPA style, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Well, let's read the label on the back, shall we? Brewed with well water, the original well sunk in 1758 is still in use, the hard water being drawn from 85 feet underground. Malted barley, hops, and yeast. Fermented in open-top stone Yorkshire squares to create an exceptionally full-flavored complex ale with an abundance of maltiness and fruity hop character. This is a firmly hopped, elegantly balanced, authentic India, English India Pale Ale. Like the original pale ales, old world style, ABV is not that high. This is 5.0 ABV, and very few of the Samuel Smith beers are high ABV. Most of them fall in the range of between 4 and 5.5% ABV. There's a couple of heavy ones, an Imperial Stout and a barley wine, if memory serves, that are a bit heavier. But most of them are of this fairly traditional style. So, without much further ado, let's go and pour this out into a pub glass, as should be expected, really. Look at this bottle, foil cap. So this was actually pretty affordable at Tamura's. About $6.50 for this bottle here. Should be fairly fresh because I haven't seen this one for sale before, so which means it hasn't been sitting on the shelf. So, a nice golden amber, more or less clear. There might be a slight chill haze to it, but more or less clear. Moderately carbonated, with an off-white to beige head that is frothy to thick. Very beer flavored smelling. So we got some bready maltiness. Earthy and floral hops. A slight caramelized tang. But most of all, it really has that very beer smell to it. I think this is like the first time I've actually got it at something at the ideal temperature. Well, let's get on the palate, shall we? Hmm. bit more bitter than I was expecting. Other old world style IPAs haven't been all that bitter to me, but that might be because many of them that I've tried have been imports and of such were not fresh. This one, like I said, I'm sure is fairly fresh because I haven't seen this at Tamura on the shelf at Tamura's before, so I know it's fairly fresh import. So a sort of zesty bitterness up front, nowhere near as intense or tannic feeling as New World style IPAs. Despite the maltiness smelling bready on the nose, the hopping gives it much more of a crackery sort of taste on the palate. Fairly light and refreshing at 5.0. How could it not be? But still much more, it does feel thicker and a bit more intense than most session IPAs, even though it's really at about the same ABV strength as a session IPA, though I have no idea how much of the residual sugars or alpha oils are, in this compared to a session IPA that is, the descendant of the West Coast style IPAs. Speaking of, is anyone making hazy session IPAs? That's actually an interesting question. Is it possible? I don't know. The finish has a residual bitterness that isn't too strong. It doesn't cling to the mouth. It's there. Mids have almost a citric tang underneath that um, crackery to bready, I would say, malts. There is a nice juxtaposition of how fairly sweet it smells versus the dryness on the palate. Yes. It does seem the malts are slightly. There's a slight caramelized taste to the malts. It's perfectly fine. It's just not something I usually associate with IPAs. Um, I guess, yeah, when I think about it, thinking back to the old world style IPAs, yeah, it has been something along those lines has been part of the flavor profile. So yeah, now that I think about it, yeah, that's two style. What gets me though is just the freshness of the hops up front. You know that there's still quite a bit of bitterness and still very vivid sensory notes to be direct, to be experienced from this. Excuse me. I have to say I'm really enjoying this. It's not deeply complex. but it is surprisingly subtle, and it's great beer. I'm enjoying it. Probably because good old world style IPAs are fairly hard to find. Good, well, I should go ahead and qualify that. Good, fresh old world style IPAs are hard to find. I have to say, though, that old world style IPAs tend to age better than the new world style ones do, which tend to fall a lot more flat once the hops start to fade. Whereas, with old world style ones, the flavor profile definitely does shift quite a bit, but it still remains quite drinkable. I've had some like past due New World style, West Coast style IPAs that were very, very difficult to drink. Which makes sense. The heavy hopping of the India Pale Ale was developed so that beers could be preserved better through the time, heat, and distance of the shipping to India, where they were drunk, where these beers were drunk by colonial administrators from the United Kingdom. And back then, old world style India Pale Ales also had the reputation of being heavy, but 5.0 ABV was actually heavy compared to, milds and bitters, which were the basic pub styles back then, which would, range from about 3.0 to 4.5 ABV. I really want to go and try a mild one some day or another. But it's not a style that you see for sale. Heck, or even bitter. I think I actually have tried one bitter, but I haven't reviewed it. I would love to review it, though. It's coming. This is actually really interesting. While the caramelized aspect of the flavor on the palate is kind of expanding as it warms up more and more, and the orange is getting a little bit more difficult to find, it's still there, but not as immediately apparent. Maybe it's actually showing up a bit more in the finish now rather than the front and mids. You know, this is a really interesting beer. I'm really thoroughly enjoying it. And yeah, I definitely do recommend these Samuel Smith beers from England to, I think it's, well, there's maybe two or three more breweries imports from the United Kingdom here in Hawaii, but this is really the easiest one to find. To go and give yourself a sort of experience with English pub ales. Granted, is not really trad in that it's not cask as opposed it's I believe this is forced carbonated like most bottled beers are nowadays. It's not a cask ale, and they generally sell and make more styles geared towards modern tastes, but they try to hold to tradition. And that's part of their branding for both their beer and the pubs that they run. And like I said, they're not that expensive, even here in Hawaii. This flew halfway across the world and still only cost me $6.50. Well worth it in my book. Sorry, my throat's like all. My voice is kind of weird. That whiskey last night kind of did a number on me because I also had acid reflux, and there's nothing like hard liquor and acid reflux that can really, really go and mess up your voice box. So, Samuel Smith India Ale. One of the originals, the OG, OGs. I mean, the kids now say goats instead of OGs, but you know what I mean. Definitely give this a shot. While it is not your traditional, well, I guess this is the traditional, while it's not your expected IPA experience, it is the traditional one that begs to be looked at and begs to be celebrated much more than it is. It's really a shame that this style has come superseded by so many other, I think, less worthy IPA styles. And that's just my hot take. I'm sorry. I know a lot of people who do these beer. I watch a lot of these other beer and review channels, and they generally don't do any hot takes. I do a lot of hot takes. Don't care. I want to see more old world style IPAs. So I'm going to say that up front. More old world style IPAs, less hazy juice bombs, juice and alcohol bombs, please. Well, that's your beer review for tonight, folks. Cheers.